What if I told you that World War II didn't end in 1945? At least, not for everyone. What if, deep in the Philippine jungle, a Japanese soldier kept fighting the war for nearly 3 decades after Japan surrendered, unaware or perhaps unwilling to believe that his empire had fallen? This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, the Japanese intelligence officer who became a legend, a ghost of war, and one of the most extraordinary holdouts in military history. His tale is one of loyalty, survival, and obsession, a story that challenges how we think about duty, honor, and the cost of war. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we'll peel back the layers of myth and fact surrounding Onoda's Jungle War, a saga that lasted until 1974. Stick around to the very end, because this story has twists you won't believe. And if you're new here, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more immersive journeys through hidden corners of history. Early life, the making of a soldier. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Kainan, Japan, into a family steeped in traditional values. Like many boys of his generation, he grew up under the militarized atmosphere of pre-war Japan, where loyalty to emperor and nation wasn't just expected, it was drilled into daily life. He was the son of a samurai-descended family, which gave him a lifelong obsession with Bushido, the way of the warrior. Fun fact, even as a child, Onoda's teachers described him as serious, stubborn, and loyal to a fault. By the time he came of age, Japan was already at war across Asia and the Pacific. Onoda enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army at just 20 years old, training as an intelligence officer. Unlike regular infantry, intelligence officers were schooled in psychological warfare, guerrilla tactics, and survival skills, tools that would later keep him alive in isolation. Deployment to the Philippines. In 1944, as Japan's empire began to crumble under Allied offensives, Onoda was dispatched to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were clear: wage guerrilla warfare against Allied forces. Sabotage infrastructure like airstrips and docks. Never surrender. And most importantly, survive until the Japanese army returned. This never surrender doctrine was not unique to Onoda. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was dishonorable, worse than death. To yield was to betray the emperor. Lubang was a small island, but strategically important. However, the garrison was disorganized, and Onoda quickly clashed with commanding officers. His pleas to fortify positions and destroy key installations were ignored. By early 1945, the island fell to U.S. and Filipino forces. Most Japanese soldiers surrendered or were killed, but not Onoda. The Jungle War begins. Onoda retreated into the dense jungle with 3 comrades: Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. Together, they formed a tiny guerrilla band, hunting, raiding villages, and evading capture. Fun fact, they survived largely on bananas, coconuts, and stolen rice, supplementing their diet with carabao, Filipino water buffalo, and wild plants. Onoda's survival training paid off. He could start fires without matches and navigate by stars. For the villagers of Lubang, Onoda's group were not soldiers, but phantoms of terror. They raided farms, stole food, and sometimes killed locals who they believed were enemy collaborators. The war ends, but not for Onoda. Here's where the story takes its most astonishing turn. In August 1945, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was over, but deep in the jungle, Onoda and his men didn't believe it. Leaflets were dropped from planes announcing Japan's surrender. Onoda examined them carefully, but concluded they were enemy propaganda. To him, the idea of Japan surrendering was unthinkable. Over the years, more evidence arrived. Newspapers, family letters, even recordings from loudspeakers. Still, Onoda refused to accept the war was over. His training had conditioned him to believe that the enemy would try to trick him into surrendering. So for him, the war raged on. Life in the jungle, 1945s to 1950s. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Onoda's group carried out sporadic guerrilla raids. They clung to their mission, destroying rice stores, shooting at search parties, and exchanging fire with local police. In 1949, Private Akatsu, one of Onoda's men, surrendered to Philippine forces. His departure shook the group, but Onoda interpreted it as betrayal. To him, Akatsu had given in to the enemy. For the next 2 decades, Onoda and his remaining comrades lived a cycle of foraging, hiding, and fighting. They patched uniforms with scraps of cloth, sharpened rusting rifles, and avoided patrols. One particularly grim fact: Onoda's group killed around 30 Filipinos during their long resistance. To the villagers, they weren't heroic soldiers. They were feared bandits. Deaths in the jungle. By the 1950s and 1960s, the group's numbers dwindled. 1954, Corporal Shimada was killed in a shootout with a Filipino patrol. 1972, Kinshichi Kozuka, Onoda's last companion, was shot by police while burning rice fields. Onoda was now alone, the last man standing. Think about this. By 1972, the world had changed. Man had landed on the moon. The Vietnam War raged, yet Onoda still fought a war from 1945. Discovery by Norio Suzuki. The story might have ended with Onoda dying in the jungle, but fate had another twist. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki set off on a world journey. He told friends he was looking for 1. A panda. 2. The abominable snowman. 3. A Japanese soldier still fighting World War II. Amazingly, he found the third. When Suzuki encountered Onoda in the jungle, Onoda was cautious. But Suzuki's sincerity broke through decades of mistrust. Onoda agreed to leave the jungle, but only if he received official orders from his commanding officer. The surrender. Japan tracked down Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now a civilian working in a bookstore. He traveled to Lubang and, in a surreal moment, delivered Onoda's original orders, in person, 29 years later. On March 9, 1974, Hiroo Onoda emerged from the jungle, wearing his tattered uniform, carrying a functioning rifle with 500 rounds of ammunition and a ceremonial sword. He formally surrendered to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who pardoned him for his actions. Returned to Japan, a man out of time. Onoda's return was like stepping out of a time machine. He had left a devastated wartime empire and returned to a modern, peaceful Japan filled with neon lights, televisions, and a youth culture that baffled him. To some Japanese, he was a hero, a symbol of loyalty and perseverance. To others, he was a relic, a man who had needlessly killed civilians for decades. Fun fact: Onoda was so shocked by modern Japan's consumerism that he briefly moved to Brazil to become a cattle rancher before later returning to Japan. Later life and legacy. In his later years, Onoda wrote an autobiography titled No Surrender: My 30-Year War, which became an international bestseller. He also founded survival training camps for Japanese youth, teaching resilience and self-discipline. Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. His legacy is complex. To some, he was the ultimate example of loyalty and duty. To others, a tragic figure who wasted decades of his life on a war long over. But one thing is certain: his story forces us to ask, what does it mean to be truly loyal? And when does loyalty become a cage? Fun facts and myth busting. Myth: Onoda didn't know the war was over. Truth: he knew about the surrender but chose not to believe it, interpreting all evidence as enemy tricks. Onoda's rifle was still fully operational in 1974. He had oiled and maintained it meticulously. His uniform, though patched and worn, was still intact when he surrendered. After surrender, Onoda kept his sword and dagger, symbols of his samurai heritage. Hiroo Onoda's life is more than just a bizarre footnote in World War II. It's a story of how belief can shape reality, of how a single man, armed with conviction and a rifle, can fight a war against time itself. His jungle vigil reminds us that wars don't truly end when treaties are signed. They linger, in memory, in culture, and sometimes in the hearts of men who cannot let go. So, what do you think? Was Hiroo Onoda a hero of unshakable loyalty, or a tragic figure trapped by indoctrination? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's strangest stories, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps this channel alive and lets us keep uncovering the forgotten corners of history. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the past.